In February 1895, the Marquess of Queensberry, who was mad, called in at the Albemarle Club in London and left a card. It's difficult to be precise about what he scrawled. The Marquess's writing was not of the best, but we think it reads, "For Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite." The consequences for Wilde were immense. Trials, prison, exile, disgrace. More of that in a while. My guest, who's chosen Oscar Wilde today, was once described as a high-powered satirical weapon in a New York Times book review. He's an author who has said that he writes in order to astonish, and who was famously fired from The Observer while covering John Major's 1997 election campaign. Perhaps more of that in a while. His books include Walking to Hollywood, Cock and Bull, and The Book of Dave, while his collection of short stories, Tough, Tough Toys for Tough, Tough Boys, won the Aga Khan Prize for fiction. He is Will Self. Why, Will, have you chosen Oscar Wilde?
I'm a fan of the writing. I have some misgivings about the life, which doubtless we'll get to. But I think most of all I chose him in a way because I think that Richard Ellman's biography of Wilde is probably the finest work of literary biography that's ever been written. And I think that of all the figures I've read about, I feel closest to Wilde in a emotional way.
I was pleased about this choice because he is a life as well as an oeuvre. He said himself that he said, I put my genius into my life and my talent into my work. You can't separate him from the life, can you?
You can't separate him. In De Profundis, this astonishing kind of part mea culpa, part reviling of the hypocrisy of English society, part confessional that he wrote in prison after losing his libel case against the Marquess of Queensberry. He said that, you know, quite unashamedly, he said the point about me is that I'm one of those rare men whose life embodies the spirit of the age. And there's very few people who would dare to say that and for it to be true.
You've written this, Will. You think the big man, as you put it, was guilty of an overweening pride, and arguably by bringing to public attention a social development that was happening inexorably, set back the cause of homosexual liberation in Britain by half a century. Now, without going into too much detail about the trial, which we'll come to, what do you mean by that?
I was perhaps shooting from the hip on that one, perhaps an apposite phrase. I think, you know, it was said that on the night of Wilde's conviction, 600 single gentlemen crossed on the Calais packet to France. So there was this enormous exodus of,
must have been quite a crossing,
of gay men to the continent in the wake of this. But you have to bear in mind that the actual offence of consenting to homosexual activities in private had been made an offence the year before.
Yes,
so there was a climate of repression already going around. But as the standard bearer, and he had been the standard bearer in this peculiar act of, you know, social and cultural doubling that he was involved in really for 15 or 20 years, he was the focus, the cynosure of a kind of openly gay movement in England at the time. And I think his pride and his arrogance in taking on the Marquess of Queensberry.
Aggression.
Yeah, I mean, everybody around him pleaded with him to flee, which was the established thing to do. It was done a lot. I think had he fled, I think those 600 gentlemen wouldn't have needed to go to the continent. I think that it was quite possible that the fact of him having to flee alone would have dampened down, cooled down the somewhat hothouse atmosphere surrounding openly gay expressions, both cultural and artistic at the time. And it's quite possible that the cause of homosexual liberation might have been rather smoother in this country than it in fact turned out to be.
Also with us is Franny Moyle, author of Constance, the tragic and scandalous life of Mrs. Oscar Wilde. Some listeners might be surprised to hear that Wilde had a wife. Is that why you wrote the book, Franny?
Yes, I think it probably is, in a nutshell. She was equally a victim of the time because she suffered. She didn't go to jail, but she was forced into exile with their 2 children.
It's a really sad story.
It's a
I've read the
terrible
book.
story. And so she was punished as badly, I think, by modern standards, the treatment of these people by society is intolerable, inexcusable.
Did the marriage start as a real marriage? What was Wilde's sexuality, would you say?
Well, I think very much it did start as a real marriage. And Oscar had a lot of girlfriends, and that's pretty well recorded. And one of his very early girlfriends was Florrie Balcombe, who went on to become Mrs. Bram Stoker, for example. Women liked him, and he liked women.
But, the thing about homosexuality in the late Victorian period is that there was so much hypocrisy in so much sexual conduct. The streets of London were thronged with prostitutes. I think Ellman says in his biography that, Wilde's attitude towards the renters, in inverted commas, in other words, the prostitutes that he frequented and that were the essence of his downfall, was that of any man towards any prostitute, you see. So it was of a piece in that way. Not very nice, if you like.
Not very nice,
no.
and a life, as Franny said, overlaid with tragedy. Maybe best summed up in the letter Wilde wrote from Reading Gaol to his lover Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas, the Marquess of Queensberry's son. The letter was published as De Profundis, from the depths, and here's Simon Russell Beale reading from it.
I amuse myself with being a flaneur, a dandy, a man of fashion. I surrounded myself with smaller natures and meaner minds. I became the spendthrift of my own genius. Tired of being on the heights, I deliberately went to the depths in the search for new sensations. What the paradox was to me in the sphere of thought, perversity became to me in the sphere of passion. Desire at the end was a malady or a madness, or both. I grew careless of the lives of others. I took pleasure where it pleased me and passed on. I forgot that every little action of the common day makes or unmakes character. I ceased to be lord over myself. I was no longer captain of my soul, and did not know it. I allowed you to dominate me, and your father to frighten me. I ended in horrible disgrace.
Let's run quickly through some of the details of his life. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde was born in 1854. Franny, tell us a little bit about his parents and his background.
Well, I suppose you would say his father was something of a self-made man, in that, his father was a very eminent eye surgeon who had kind of made his own way.
And sexually quite wayward himself. He entered the marriage with three illegitimate children.
A complete character, clearly with an enormous sex drive. I think, that's something he and Oscar completely shared, because we know of three illegitimate children, but of course there was a fourth claimed in a very scandalous court case that went public, something that foreshadows Oscar's own demise. In a very spooky way, his father was taken to court by a woman who claimed effectively that he'd raped her, and the shame of that really destroyed his father's career. He sort of retreated.
His mother, Speranza, as she called herself, was an Irish patriot and a nationalist. And this is at a time when Protestants and Catholics in the South are forging the modern nationalist movement. But at the same time, Speranza ends up on a civil list or a Royal Literary Fund pensions. William Wilde is knighted. I think he was oculist to the
Queen Victoria.
To Queen Victoria. So you have here a strange doubling of opposition to the British state and yet co-option by it.
And a desire for acceptance, because she was fascinated by society and acceptance. And I think Oscar, and if you can inherit that kind of traits, that he certainly did.
I'm trying to form a mental picture of the young Oscar at Trinity, Dublin, where he decided to be, in a fairly extravagant way, an aesthete.
I think the dandyism is there very, very early on, and when he gets to Trinity, Dublin, he's almost immediately in conflict with his dons and his tutors over his dandiacal carryings on.
Here's Lily Langtry talking about him. Oscar had longish hair and wore an outfit that spoke of bohemian credentials: light-coloured trousers, a black frock coat, brightly coloured waistcoats with a white silk cravat held with an amethyst pin, and always carrying lavender gloves.
Yes, well, I mean, he launches his entree really on the London scene at a show at the Grosvenor Gallery, which was the pace setter for showing the kind of new artists. And there's sketches, I can't remember the sketches by, of Wilde wearing his cello coat, So you can see where he was coming from.
Didn't Constance see where he was coming from?
Well, absolutely, and I think this was part of the appeal. I mean, Constance, I think, was a sort of bit of a black sheep of her family. I think she also rather liked the fact that her family disapproved of him in the way a lot of young people do, you know.
Let's just touch briefly on his poetry. I know the literary world has not agreed on whether he was a good poet or not, but his first book of poems, which was published in 1881, was summed up in the Saturday Review. Mr. Wilde's verses belong to a class which is the special terror of reviewers, the poetry which is neither good nor bad, which calls for neither praise nor ridicule.
It's very rococo, and it's very kind of... I think another reviewer said of that first book, entitled Poems, and kind of printed in an edition of 150 on vellum or something like that, and kind of bound in lavender, that it was pointless to criticise it, Mr. Wilde's poems, because most of them belonged to somebody else, and then quotes a long line, and it became a scandal in its own right, this volume, when the Oxford Union, having requested it for their library, then rejected it, and it became, like many things in Wilde's life, a kind of cause célèbre. So it's not the poetry that draws me to Wilde. Where he finds himself is in prose,
yes.
but I think as an essayist is where I find him most powerful.
Yes.
When he wrote that volume, he was living with a young painter called Frank Miles. They shared a house together in Chelsea, and Frank Miles's father, who's a vicar, was so appalled by the sort of suggestive undertones of the poetry that Oscar was sort of asked to, to
I know,
leave.
it's a shocking irony, considering that, in fact, his boy Frank was up to far worse things at the time than Oscar actually was.
Absolutely, but I think what it does show is this desire really early on, and although he hadn't found his mark, he hadn't quite found his métier, there's this desire early on to just test the boundaries of society,
yes.
just see how far you can kind of go and get away with.
Well, he did, and he did
stuff.
quite early on. He turned himself into, as you say, a cause célèbre. In 1882, he was invited on a lecture tour of America by Richard D'Oyley Carte, selling this charming aesthete to American audiences. He gave 140 lectures over 260 days, and here's his grandson, Merlin Holland, talking about it.
He had never given a lecture before he went to America. Indeed, he got some training, some speech training, from an actor in London at the time called Herman Vezin. And all he had in his suitcase, so to speak, when he arrived in America was a sort of general amalgam of Whistler, Rossetti, Ruskin, Pater. Some of them even quoted verbatim in the first month or so of his lecturing there. And I think he thought he was going over to tell the Americans really quite seriously, very un-Oscar in a sense as we think of him now, about what he termed the English Renaissance in art. And the lecture, when you read the reconstructions of it, is pretty heavy going.
What do you think American audiences in the Midwest made of him, Will?
I think they found him enormously fascinating and charming. And one of the things you've got to remember about Wilde, if we can get through everything else, is that he was an enormously charismatic and charming man. And many people commented on his great kindness. It was a very outre to come on, particularly in the States, which was a young and defiantly macho country, though of course it had its own apostles of gay aestheticism as well. To come on with this shtick, in essence, required enormous front, and I think the Americans kind of rose to that. They liked the chutzpah of it.
You're listening to The Great Life of Oscar Wilde, proposed by Will Self. Also here is Franny Moyle, biographer of Wilde's wife. In 1887, Wilde became editor of Ladies' World magazine, soon renamed The Woman's World. But he left, bored, in 1889, and the following year published The Portrait of Dorian Gray. Will, you have written a book called Dorian, bringing Dorian Gray up to date, is that right?
The thing that fascinated me immediately about Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray was that this is a book that's all about time. There are various fascinating things about it. One is it's one of the only real modern myths that we have. We could go out from Broadcasting House here into the street and pick somebody at random, and they would know about the picture of Dorian Gray. They probably wouldn't have read it, But in this book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is all about the ravaging effects of time, the decadent Dorian Gray remains pristine and young while the picture in the attic ages horribly. There is no external referent to time in it. There are no newspapers, there's no political events in the book. It is an enclosed, tightly enclosed and claustrophobic world. Indeed, you have to read the book quite closely to determine how many years have passed between when the portrait was painted and when it's exposed at the end. And I analysed the book and discovered this was 17 years. I automatically thought, well, what period of contemporary history do we have? And actually, completely coincidentally, or perhaps not, the period between the first cases of what came to be called AIDS on the west coast of America and the introduction of antiretroviral treatments was exactly 17 years. So I thought, well, that's it. I'm going to take the picture of Dorian Gray and I'm going to update it to the modern era. But of course, the book itself is about disease, physical disease as well. There's strong evidence, and certainly his main biographer, Ellman, believes that Wilde himself had contracted syphilis. So, you know, the picture of Dorian Gray itself can be seen, the original, as an extended metaphor for disease.
You've said that in order to write the book, you tried to make yourself gay as possible.
Not hard to do.
Isn't it?
Well, it's very interesting, all of this stuff. When I was writing Dorian, and I hugely enjoyed it. I started off writing it as a film script, but I came to certain stage directions, and I thought this movie's never going to be made, not in the form that I envisaged it. So I turned it back into prose narrative fiction. And when I was writing Dorian, I had erotic dreams about men. I was strongly attracted to men. But me being me, I started thinking, well, everybody's gay, which is perhaps not true. It wasn't until the book came out, and a friend of mine came back that summer and said, it's the hit, darling, on the beaches of Mykonos. Everybody's reading it. But actually, sales were rather disappointing. And that's when I realised that perhaps everybody wasn't gay.
W.H. Smith perhaps felt that everybody wasn't gay.
Smith wouldn't take it, actually. Wouldn't take my Dorian.
Talking of which, Franny, let's talk about his lovers. You suggested in your book that from 1887 to 1889, his conquests at least included artist Graham Robertson, Clark Fred Alphus, American playwright Clyde Fitch, writer John Gray. But the two that really mattered were Robbie Ross and Bosie. And it's about these two men that I'd like to ask you.
Robbie was someone who's introduced to Oscar and Constance's world relatively early on. I mean, I suppose they'd been married, 2 to 3 years, and Robbie was their young lodger. 17, 18, he was at a sort of local crammer in Covent Garden trying to get into Oxford. But already a very sort of precocious, sexually precocious young man. And, you know, Oscar does say that it was Robbie that seduced him. And then, of course, Bosie was some years later.
Bosie, I mean, if you could go back in time and painlessly cull somebody with a high-velocity rifle bullet, it would be Lord Alfred Douglas. Or, I mean, you might stop off in Vienna to bag Hitler, but I think you'd also go on and try and get Bosie.
What's quite interesting about Oscar's life, I think, is his ability to be manipulated. For such a huge character who, as we said, is very ballsy. He can dress up in funny clothes. He has no fear of audiences. He will entertain a room, but his mother tells him to do something and he will do it. And Bosie brought out this strange element in his character that actually was a profound weakness to certain influences, and Bosie could do anything. He was like a puppet under Bosie's influence.
And unfortunately, Bosie was the son of the Marquess of Queensberry, which takes us on to Wilde's downfall. The Marquess of Queensberry conceived a great dislike for Wilde, believing that he was corrupting his son.
The Marquess of Queensberry, nobody really has a good word for him. He's not a particularly savoury character. A bit bonkers, seems to have abused his wife as well. Had this kind of global anxiety about a kind of tribe of Sodomites kind of creeping
corrupting
around.
his sons.
But the reality, of course, was that his sons almost certainly were just gay anyway.
He was, however, right in his accusation.
Totally
his
right.
son was having an affair with Wilde.
They had an affair. It's questionable how long the actual sexual relationship went on.
I think that's right. I suspect it was quite short.
I think it was short-lived.
Actually.
I mean, I suspect the fact of the matter was that they both enjoyed a kind of, basically a kind of cruising together, a kind of de haut en bas sexual activity.
Let's gallop as fast as we can through the court case. Wilde made the great mistake of deciding to sue the Marquess of Queensberry for suggesting that he was gay. Now, I've variously heard it said that Wilde had no choice but to sue, and if he hadn't sued, people would have assumed the libel was true, and heard it said that it was the biggest mistake Wilde ever made. What do you think, Franny?
I think that's wrong, because the libel was a fairly local one. It was on a card in a club. Now, OK, the porter who took the card would have seen it. No doubt there would have been whispers in the club. Perhaps it
something
would have
in the Pall Mall
out.
Gazette.
I don't think they would have gone that far. And in fact, a lawyer did actually say, if you had come to me at the beginning, I would have told you to just tear it up.
All through his work, he is leading with the chin towards this. For 20 years, he's leading towards this moment, in a sense. And he has, throughout his work, scattered his anticipations of this moment in his own work. I mean, what an astonishing dramatic moment. At the time Wilde goes into this trial with Queensberry and then the subsequent trials, his plays are on in the West End. 2 plays running at the same time. The Importance of Being Earnest and The Ideal Husband, both huge hits, opening nights attended by the Prince of Wales, the cream of English. But it's pure Wilde. It's pure Wilde, because those plays, in my view, are some of the most insidious, clever, scalpel-like dissections of Victorian hypocrisy and society that there were. So the theatre of it, I think, overcame him as much as anything else.
It was the fact that he took it to the courts, I think.
Yeah.
I think it was the innate
I don't agree with you.
hypocrisy.
I think you've got to look at the time. We're getting into the world of jingo, the increased machismo of the late British Empire in that way. And
you think they would have got him
I
in
dare
the
say,
end?
but
Yes,
I think
do.
Franny has a point. I mean, it was when Geoffrey Archer sued over allegations that he'd been seeing
Yes, I
a
think there's
prostitute
something of
that
that.
sympathy for him began to evaporate.
And again, I think Bosie is very important in this sort of cocktail, because Oscar, when Bosie wasn't around, was a very different character, as far as we can tell from
the
Oscar when
relationship
Bosie
with
was
his
around.
wife reasserted
You know,
itself. And that's
Exactly.
what's so poignant about your book. Quite clearly, apart from the Bosie element, that marriage could well have survived.
And extraordinarily, I think Constance expected it to.
Tell us what happened to Constance after her husband's
Constance
conviction.
fled the country almost immediately. I mean, she very quickly got her 2 sons out of the country. And she changed her name to Holland, Mrs. Holland, on the advice of friends.
Which is still the family's name.
Which is still the family's name. And again, that was really to hide.
Yeah.
So she lost not only her status, her family, but their house and, creditors swarmed. But she fled and then tried very hard to have a sort of even relationship with Oscar. She visited him in prison, for example. And there is a great sense that she was prepared to see him and try and work out some relationship on his release.
He had been convicted 2 years, hard labour, wrote De Profundis in 1897, and later the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which contains the line, "I never saw a man who looked with such a wistful eye upon that little tent of blue, which prisoners call the sky."
2 years hard labour at that time in the late 19th century was no joke. I mean, this was on a treadmill. You're going on a treadmill for 16 hours a day, and, you get beaten if you couldn't get on it. Picking oakum, picking apart, rope. He speaks of having his nails broken. His health was absolutely broken and destroyed.
Well, it broke his spirit, not just his health. I mean, that's evident that when he came out, he was not the man physically, but neither mentally, that went in. He getting back to writing, trying to focus was very hard for him.
And for Constance too, Franny, a really sad end.
Very sad. I mean, Constance died before her husband. She died when she was just 40. She had suffered some chronic disease, which is very hard to work out exactly what it was, possibly a gynecological condition, and died after an operation that clearly went very wrong for her. So.
Which brings me to a closing question. I've been bursting to ask this, but it seemed a little mean-spirited. Was he actually very good as a writer?
Yes, he was very good. I mean, the epigrams are superb. I mean, everybody will know at least one or two. They hold. When I wrote my version of Dorian, I simply had to translate his epigrams into modern idioms.
The epigrams are fantastic, but I really wonder whether quite a lot of his talent isn't just a string of brilliant epigrams held together by not too clever script writing. He had a talent for surprising juxtaposition.
I think he casts a long shadow. I mean,
I think it's a bit formulaic.
Well,
you know, he puts together antitheses. You know, he hasn't an enemy in the world, and none of his friends like him. You can do that. It's quite easy. I do it in my own sketch writing.
I would
sometimes.
argue that you do it because you learnt it from him.
I dare say.
No, you do not find somebody who practices that particular kind of dialectic of irony before Wilde. It's actually, it's achieved in Wilde, and it's achieved dramaturgically in the plays in a very powerful effect. They remain still in production and valid satires on the English class system
But
today,
that's partly because we all just go around saying how marvellous Wilde was. I agree about the dialecticism, but the characters, that they're not in depth, they're not real characters, they're all the same from play to play. There's no real development.
But that was Wilde's view. It's there in The Soul of Man Under Socialism. You know, he didn't actually believe that most people were individuals in a very important sense.
Well, they are.
Well, that's your contention, but you have to bear in mind that Wilde was a philosopher of aesthetics and had a particular view about how culture operated, and that the reason why he makes his characters thin and poorly drawn was because that's the way he saw society render people. Does
the tragedy make him? If he had lived to a ripe old age and been sort of quietly gay like Somerset Maugham or Noel Coward, would he be as famous? And would we?
I don't think if you'd been around Cap Ferrar in the 1930s, you'd have thought Willie Maugham was being quietly gay. I'm always of the belief that, you know, I don't like tragedy, and I don't like the way that Wilde was broken in that way. I think it was a vicious, dark thing, and whatever his sins, and frankly, the person, you know, who is in a position to either forgive him or not would be Constance. It's not up to society, in my view. And my view is I would have loved him to go on to live a long and productive life. Why not?
My thanks to Will Self, who chose The Great Life of Oscar Wilde, and to Mrs. Wilde's biographer, Franny Moyle. Goodbye.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to this Great Lives podcast. Many other BBC programmes are available as podcasts. You can find details at bbc.co.uk/Radio4.